the book of Ecclesiastes. I thought I would start by going back a little bit. Why are we going to do a study on such a depressing book? And if you read through this and kind of look at it and just kind of think about it, you say, Solomon, we've heard lots of teaching about how that Solomon is writing here from the perspective of human wisdom. Well, I found a commentary by a fellow by the name of Walter Kaiser, and he takes a kind of a little bit different approach to this book. One of his outline points is enjoying life as a gift from God. By way of introduction, there's kind of a recurring theme that I would like to just touch on real quick. And in order to get at that, I want you to turn to chapter 2 for a moment. Ecclesiastes chapter 2. And as we think about the idea of this is man's wisdom, I'm reminded of 1 Corinthians 1:25. The foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. The recurring theme that we have here is along these lines. Chapter 2 of Ecclesiastes, verse 24. There is nothing better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that he should make his soul enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw, that it was from the hand of God. For who can eat, or who else can hasten hereunto more than I? For God giveth to a man that is good in his sight, wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner he giveth travail, to gather and to heap up, that he may give to him that is good before God. This is vanity and vexation of spirit. Then the next repeat of this is in chapter 5. We're going to be looking tonight at chapters 4 and 5. But in chapter 5, verse 18 and following, we have this. Behold, that which I have seen, it is good and comely for one to eat and to drink and enjoy the good of all his labor, that he taketh under the sun all the days of his life, which God giveth him, for it is his portion. Every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and he hath given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he shall not much remember the days of his life, because God answereth him in the joy of his heart. So we've got two more to look at real quick, but you get what is going on here is that it's like Solomon is digging into the low depths of human wisdom and coming up for air and saying, but God is still there. And down again he goes, and up again he comes and said, but God is still there. Chapter 8, verse 15. Then I commended mirth, because a man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry, for that shall abide with him of his labor the days of his life, which God giveth him under the sun. God is there. And then the last two verses of the book, chapter 12. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment, with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. So the book of Ecclesiastes, in a sense, kind of be a depressing book, I suppose, because after all, there's a lot of things that are vanity and vexation of spirit throughout the book. And it's often repeated. But he comes back up. It's kind of like you can envision a mountain peak, you're standing on it, and you look out over the valleys in front of you and see nothing but clouds, but a peak here, and a peak there, and a peak over there. And, that picture comes to my mind when I think of Ecclesiastes. He's down under the clouds, and he comes up to the peak and says, God is still there. The foolishness of God is wiser than men. Well, Mr. Kaiser points to the section that I'm looking at tonight, and he actually starts it at chapter 3 and verse 1. His thinking on this particular passage is that while it says that, let's read it through. Chapter 3, verse 1. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to break down, and a time to build up, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get, and a time to lose, a time to keep, and a time to cast away, a time to rend, and a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak, a time to love, and a time to hate, a time of war, and a time of peace. The point being in this that God has everything under control. There's a time for everything. And God has got it under control. And so we look at this and we say, well, there's a time to be born, and we know that. That's happened to most of us here this evening. And a time to die, and that hasn't happened to any of us yet, but the time is coming for all of us. And God knows about when that time was before He created anything, when the time of birth was, when the time of death would be. It's all under His control. So then Solomon kind of goes down into the valley, if you will, and he starts looking at what's going on around him in life, and he sees a few things. For example, verse 16 in chapter 3. Verse 16. He says, "Moreover, I saw under the sun the place of judgment, that wickedness was there, and the place of righteousness, that iniquity was there. I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every purpose and for every work," and so on. So one of the things that he comes up with, Solomon does, is, okay, so here we have all this time for this and time for that. God is in control, but look at the place of justice. Is there always justice at the place of justice? Is there always righteousness at the place where there ought to be righteousness? Well, no, there isn't. And it would lead us to think that, well, then maybe God isn't in all that much control after all. You know, the place of justice, you don't have to look at paper too much to find that justice often is never really evenly meted out. There's cases you hear of just this week. There was a man in this area who had been in jail for a time for a murder that they determined he in fact did not commit. How long was he in jail? 12 years? 18 years? How much of that 18 years is he going to get back now? Well, he's lost it all. And you might say to yourself, well, that doesn't seem just. It doesn't seem right. And if God is in control, how come that's the way that is? That's one of the arguments that Solomon is coming up with. Let's go on now to chapter 3, verse 18. "I said in mine heart concerning the estate of the sons of men, that God might manifest them, and that they might see that they themselves are beasts. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them, as the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they have all one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence above a beast, for all is vanity." So here we have another thing that might make somebody say, well, God must not be in control. Your friends and neighbors have no doubt said these to you. You say there's a loving God, there's no justice, and people die. It's an evidence, isn't it, to some who think this way, that God does not in control. Verse 21 is interesting because it talks about the spirit of man that goes upward. It is given unto man once to die and then the judgment. And the spirit of the beast that goes down to the earth. We're not the same after all. Even though it says at the end of verse 18 that they might see that they themselves are beasts. We don't, I think, fully take in how awful our sin is. And God wants us to see that we are sinners. And when we put that up against His salvation, it's so bright and stark by comparison. It's so wonderful and blessed. So Solomon is talking about the things that seem to be evidence against the idea that God is in control. Chapter 4, verse 1. "So I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and beheld the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter. And on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. Wherefore I praise the dead, which were dead are already dead, more than the living, which are yet alive," and so on. So the next little argument, if you like, against the idea that God is in control is the oppression that's in the world. People who are oppressed have nobody to turn to. as you can see what's written here. They have nobody to go to. There's nobody to help them, no comforter. The people who are meting out the oppression, they've got all the power. And again, you don't have to look too far in the newspaper to see examples of that throughout the world. And it might lead you to conclude, as we've been thinking this through here, that God is not in control. If God were in control, why are people being treated like that? Why are people being killed for their faith if God is in control? It's oppression. It's an evidence to some that God is not in control. Chapter 4 and verse 4. Again, I considered all the travail and every right work, that for this a man is envied of his neighbor. This is also vanity and vexation of spirit. The fool foldeth his hand together and eateth his own flesh. Better is an handful with quietness than both hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. So another argument here goes along these lines. The idea here is that a man works and works and works to gain the admiration of his neighbor. It's not as clear as that, I say, in the King James, but other versions put it a different way. And the way it comes out is that we all work and work and work to gain the admiration of those around us. And in fact, it's vanity and vexation of spirit, because in the end we're going to lose it all anyway. But why strive so hard in that way? Why try and seek that kind of gain? We like it if our neighbor comes over and says, "That's a nice car you've got there." Well, yeah, I worked pretty hard and I finally was able to afford it, and thank you for noticing it. And it goes to a mindset that is not toward God's things, but rather to amassing that which we can have in this life. And as we read through, we find, of course, it all gets lost. Verse 5 is kind of interesting. The fool folds his hand together and eats his own flesh. So, in contrast to verse 4, we have the man who's working and working and working so that his neighbors will envy him. And we have the next guy next door that's saying, it's not worth it. Folding your hands, this is what you do when you fold your hands, right? Now, how much work can you do like this? Not much. And what is the result, according to verse 5, if you take this approach to life? You destroy yourself, right? Eat your own flesh is kind of an odd phrase, but you destroy your own life. You destroy your own life. Eat your own flesh. So it's, when you think about that, you say, well, on one hand, I work and work and work to gain notoriety among men, and in the end, it doesn't gain me anything. So if I try the other approach, that doesn't gain me anything either. Is God in control? So we're going along and we're looking at various arguments, if you will. Solomon is, and we're just kind of looking at his thought process, that started with the whole idea in chapter 3 and verse 1 that God is in control. There's a time for everything. There's a time for this, there's a time for that, a time for war, a time for peace. Come together, stones together, time to cast them away. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. God has got times for all those things. He's in control. That's the beginning of it. And we're seeing things that maybe suggest that he really is not in control. We saw injustice. Solomon saw death. Solomon saw oppressions. And now here we're down to gaining and gaining and gaining to no avail, to no end, to great loss. Or idleness, which gets you nowhere too. Verse 7, Then I returned and saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone, and there is not a second. Yea, he hath neither child nor brother, yet is there no end of all his labor. Neither is his eye satisfied with riches. Neither saith he, For whom do I labor, and bereave my soul of good? This is also vanity, yea, it is a sore travail. So here we have somebody who, all by himself, a single man or a single woman, off in the world, gaining a living, nobody to share it with. Gaining more and more and more and more, nobody to share it with. I read something by Ray Stedman, and he was talking about William Randolph Hearst. William Randolph Hearst was a very powerful and rich man. He lived in Southern California, I guess. He's got quite a house there. William Randolph Hearst, at the end of his life, had nothing else to do but sit in his basement and watch movies. That's all he did. Nobody to share it all with. We're also familiar with Howard Hughes, a tremendously wealthy man. He had more money than he could possibly spend or use. And in the end of his life, it was a waste. He lived in an apartment. He was very unkempt, didn't cut his hair or anything, didn't shower or anything. He sat and watched a movie. And anytime somebody came in and saw him, he told somebody to give the guy a lot of money so he wouldn't tell what he saw. What a waste. All for nothing. And this would make us stop and say, well, is God in control? What a waste. And if we stop and think about it from a human perspective, those are the things that we seek after, aren't they? It would be great, wouldn't it, to have a job where we could pull down that kind of money so that we could live in a penthouse someplace or build ourselves a little castle on Lake Ontario or, well, maybe in Florida, and have a place like that to live. Wouldn't that be great? The people who have done it bear testimony time and again. It's a waste. Well, starting in verse 9 and following through to verse 12, he does talk about, the benefits of being unsingle, I guess, or whatever. 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. Again, if 2 lie together, then they have heat, but how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, 2 shall withstand him, and the threefold cord is not quickly broken. So in the contrast, at least to verse 8, Solomon thinks through how that it's good at least to have a companion, to have somebody to share with, unlike verse 8, who works and works and works and works and doesn't have anybody to give it to. Verse 13. Verse 13 is a little unusual, but I put it this way: government may not be trustworthy. Better is a poor and a wise child than an old and foolish king, who will no more be admonished. For out of prison he cometh to reign, whereas also he that is born in this kingdom becometh poor. I considered all the living which walk under the sun, with the second child that shall stand up in his stead. There is no end of all the people, even of all that have been before them. They also that come after shall not rejoice in him. Surely this is vanity and vexation of spirit. Well, it starts out with an old and foolish king here. The old and foolish king, the characteristic of this man is that he won't take advice anymore. He's got it all figured out. He's in charge. He's going to do what he wants. And then we come along with a child, a wise child. Conceptually, this wise child takes over for the king. And that's better. Better than the king because, the king was set in his ways. But in the end, what we see is that in the end of verse 16, middle of verse 16, nobody rejoices in him either. It's kind of a tiring little litany of things. The majority voted for President Bush, but by the end of his term, he was, the devil incarnate. And I suspect that probably by the end of every term, every president comes out that way. He starts out going in, I'm going to help this country. And he walks off, everybody yelling at him and shaking their fists and glad to see him go. And so we have a similar kind of thing here. We tend to think in this country that the government that we have is the best in the world. And part of that is national pride, I'm sure. Part of it is because it is. But anyway, the thing is that still our government isn't trustworthy. It isn't necessarily trustworthy. And this is what Solomon is seeing and talking about. He's saying that the king, he may not stay a good king. The next guy that comes along, he might be good for a while, but nobody will remember him in time either. When we think about that, it could lead us to conclude that God is not in charge. That brings us then to chapter 5. It starts well, and we already read the last few verses talking about God and how He really is in control. Keep thy foot, says verse 1, when thou goest to the house of God, and be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools. For they consider not, those fools, consider not that they do evil. Be not rash with thy mouth. Let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou upon earth. Therefore let thy words be few. For a dream cometh through the multitude of business, and a voiceless fool is known by multitude of words. When thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for He hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. Better is it that thou shouldest not vow than that thou shouldest vow and not pay. Suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin, neither say thou before the angel that it was an error. Wherefore should God be angry at thy voice and destroy the work of thine hands? There are many stories, I'm sure, of men who were in war and prayed to the Lord if only He would get them out of this situation, that they would devote their lives to His service. And so they're out of the situation, back in their homeland, out from under that awful situation, and they forget what they had promised God that they would do. Better is it that thou shouldest not vow than that thou shouldest vow and not pay. God pays attention to what we had to say. And as we look at the first few verses here, it talks about, really, if I could sum it up, reverence in God's presence. He is God, you know. And we saw in chapter 3, verses 1 and following, that He has a time for everything. He is in charge. And in spite of how it may look, with injustice, with oppression, with working for the wind, as it's put in here, in spite of what it looks like with death, with governments that may not be trustworthy, we find that still God is God. And I think that's really the whole point of the whole of Scriptures, but it comes down to the whole point, I think, of what God is trying to teach us through Ecclesiastes. It can be a depressing book. There's a lot of things in here. It sounds monotonous in a way sometimes. It sounds distressing. And when we read these things that we've just been talking about tonight, and how that there is oppression, how that governments aren't always trustworthy, and in fact, in some cases are shaky and are changed in a day. When we think about all these things, it rings true. We know it's all true. And it might make us conclude that, well, maybe God isn't in as much control as we would like to think. But in fact, the point is, I remember what Jim Van Duzer said just this weekend. We think about things from our perspective. Think about this book from God's perspective. What you see is man's wisdom. What God sees, of course, is that He is in control. He is in charge. So we are to respect Him when we come into His presence and not be rash with our mouth. When I read through those verses, I was reminded of the two men that went to the temple to pray, and one said, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like the rest of these bums in here. I'm a good guy. I give tithes, and I do this, and I do that. And then in the back was the man who wouldn't even lift his eyes to heaven and just said, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. God is in control. Be not rash with your mouth. Well, I already had us at verse 18, but with the time I have left, let's go back there and sum up the whole thing. And again, Mr. Kaiser kind of divides it up by how these mountain peaks that I've kind of alluded to. And here it is, verse 18. Behold, that which I have seen, it is good and comely for one to eat, to drink, and to enjoy the good of all his labor that he taketh under the sun all the days of his life, which God giveth him, for it is his portion. Every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and hath given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God. For he shall not much remember the days of his life, because God answers him in the joy of his heart. Verse 20 is kind of interesting. The whole Bible is interesting. But anyway, verse 20 is interesting because imagine you can be so taken up with God that you don't remember the things of oppression. You don't remember, they don't encroach on your mind the things of injustice. All you have in your head and your mind and in your vision is God Himself. We have blessings, great blessings as Christians because of the Lord Jesus Christ. He paid an awful price for us. We're guaranteed an inheritance in His presence. The things that happen to us in this life are all, each and every one, aimed at conforming us to the image of Jesus Christ. Do we like what's happening right now? We might. Only you can answer that individually. Do you not like what's happening right now? It's very possible. But even that thing, God is using because He has a time for everything. And He's using it to conform you to the image of Jesus Christ. When I was asked to share on this portion, the first thing I thought to myself is, I really would like to see the Lord in this passage. Let me see Jesus. And what I see is that in spite of what's going on around us in the world, God is still in control. And He has a desired end for us, which we will receive. And the things that we see in the world around us really don't matter a bit. God is in control.